everybody. I'm Tracy, and I'm a design anthropologist. Formally, at my job at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'm known as, or my title is Senior Program Officer in User Experience and Innovation, but that's really a mouthful, right? So informally, in those same halls, I'm really just referred to as the HCD lady. But I guess I'll let you in on a little secret, and that really who I think of myself inside is as a design anthropologist. I want to start today with a story. It's one I've told several times, but I'm looking out into the audience. I'm not seeing a ton of familiar faces, so I hope you will indulge me. But if you look at the image on this screen, if we were in a Hmong village in northern Thailand, this would probably be quite a familiar sight. We might see them adorning the necks of small children, or we might see them adorning the outfits that the Hmong make every year to celebrate the new year. However, you may come across someone, and it may be striking at first, who is wearing perhaps 10 or 20 of these as necklaces draped around their neck. In the particular village where I worked and had the privilege to, or lived and had the privilege to conduct research for really several years, there was one such girl who was always adorned in this way. And I learned that she had cerebral palsy. Now, one of the things that's important to know about what this image is that the promise that it provides can actually be gleaned from its name. And it's a spirit lock. Now, this is important because if one is ill, stressed, even depressed, and certainly when one is suffering from something like cerebral palsy, the belief is that what has happened is their soul has gotten up and wandered away from their body. Now, the beauty of the spirit lock is that it actually works. You don't have to get into the existential question of whether or not a silver amulet worn around your neck can actually lock your spirit into your body or not. The beauty of the spirit lock is that it acts symbolically. It acts as it is meant to provide protection, aid, comfort, care to its wearer. And when it's worn, it acts as a clarion call to that community to ultimately gather around the wearer and provide what is most needed, that aid, protection, comfort, and care. I want to go back to the term design anthropology. For some, this is sort of an uneasy relationship. People may say that these two terms are in fact antithetical to one another. And we know that in common perception, anthropology is something that sort of catalogs the past. And indeed, throughout my entire career, I've been asked, do I dig up bones? For a smaller subset of the population, we may think of it as really documenting the present day. But really, design is something that has its eyes squarely set on the future. So how is it that these two terms come together? The way I think about it is that life is socially constructed. And what I mean by this is that life emerges, the present emerges, out of the stories that we tell ourselves about the past and that set the conditions for our emergent future. What that means for design anthropology is that it helps us to translate human values, and human values are most commonly understood and shared through stories, into tangible experiences that propel us into the future. Now, you may ask where empathy fits into all of this discussion. And I would say that for anthropologists, empathy is an essential component of ethnography, that thing that we do, which is part of the process of creating relationships with the people whose lives we seek to understand and ultimately illuminate for others. But as much as empathy has always been a part of ethnography, and the photo that you see here is purportedly of Zora Neale Hurston actually doing ethnography with musicians coming from this part of the American South in sort of early 1900s. But empathy has never been the goal of ethnography. Rather, ethnography's goal is to create an interpretation of human experience in the context of specific social and cultural phenomena. And ethnography is but one of the tools that helps us do that translation of human values into tangible experiences. Many of us in this room who work with designers probably have been in the experience of thinking of empathy as more of a product. I like to think of it or call it empathy as deliverable. And industry, in fact, asks many of us to become agents of empathy, to circulate it through photos, through photos, through video, storytelling, personas, and ultimately things like empathy mapping workshops. But I want to back up for 1 minute. In Susan Lanzoni's recent work on the history of empathy, we learn that early aesthetic meanings of the term Einfühlung, and forgive me if my German is not very good, so I may not be pronouncing that well, really challenge people to stretch the limits of the self, and thus the understanding of what it is that makes us human. This notion came from the idea of self-transfer, which the science of aesthetics really understood as the value of empathy. It was that projection of one's unconscious feelings, one's inner imagined movements into a work of art itself. And indeed, half a century later, Mark Rothko would observe, the people who weep before my paintings are having the same religious experience that I had when I made them. Now, phenomenological philosophy has also weighed in on the term, taking a slightly different approach to empathy, understanding it as an experience of projection. So for Edmund Husserl and Edith Stein, empathy was an intersubjective mode of relating between humans where we fill in or we project ourselves into the lives of others. I love that phrase, an intersubjective mode of relating between humans. What does that mean? Well, that empathy is a back and forth process between humans, and that it is always mediated by our physical, our cognitive, our social, and our cultural boundaries that separate each of us and serve to shape our individual subjective experiences. Thinking about it in this way helps us understand that empathy is really an imaginative exercise, because all we can ever really do is imagine what another's lived reality is. That's the closest we can really get to it. Now, there's clearly a practical value in creating a shared and unified imagining of people's experiences. It closes the craft gap, for example, between makers and consumers in industrialized society. It also, and I think we've experienced this, probably everyone in this room, it galvanizes large organizations' understandings of the decisions they make, as well as the actions they take. However, what's become most important to me in all of this is a question as to whether we are actually becoming blinded by empathy. We invoke empathy, but when we do so, we often fail to see the unique cultural and historical layers that mediate our interpretation of the experience of others. Take the promise of virtual reality or augmented reality to bring us to a more empathetic place. That becomes, I would posit, potentially, more a way to bypass real mediation and interpretation. And in so doing, ultimately runs the risk of erasing that social and cultural context and severely limiting what we can really imagine and understand about another's experience. In my current role, as I mentioned, I'm tasked with bringing a more human-centered design perspective to the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I work with many designers who seek to extend the meaning of empathy, such that the term involves a restraining of the self to privilege an understanding of another. Laudably, this brings with it a focus on the disenfranchised. However, at the same time, I see it also as surfacing a series of tensions that arise when we lead with empathy as the tool and not simply a part of the process of social analysis. Eliding these tensions means that we fail to truly explore the spaces between difference and similarity, between distance and closeness, and between alienation and immersion. John Slaby is a neuroscientist, and his work sheds light on the rise of scientific research into empathy and what he calls the social brain. He argues that at this particular cultural and historical moment, talk of empathy actually often serves to minimize negative emotion and discontent that might be politically challenging or disruptive. This leads me to question whether when we generate and spread empathy, are we unintentionally participating in creating a veneer of care that obscures underlying tensions between consumers and businesses, or in the world of most of us here, between those who are sick and those who seek to help them, between beneficiaries and funders, such that we ultimately obscure layers of value abstraction. In my experience as an anthropologist, I know that when you experience empathy in the field, you leave a profoundly changed person for having had that experience. But at the same time, for social scientists, it's very critical to call out how it is that when we go into the field, we articulate our biases, we measure our positions of power, we clearly sit with the tensions of difference and similarity, distance and closeness, alienation and immersion. In my world, I seek to document the messy complexity of people's lives, such that one understands, for example, when designing innovative solutions to better address global healthcare needs. Behaviors must not be understood as those of rational actors who seek to minimize deficits and maximize benefits, but rather understood as a set of practices motivated by the weight of lived social norms, the precariousness of inequality, the fear of not belonging. In working with designers, I seek to emphasize a focus on care, with the ultimate goal being how to translate human values into tangible experiences of care for health. To end, empathy is one of the most delicate and powerful ways that we have of using ourselves. However, it's one piece of that. Without critical reflection on the term, on the tensions inherent in the term and the experiences it engenders, I question whether we can ever truly succeed in designing successful interventions. If we are to design interventions that are truly responsive to people in their particular cultural and historical moment. I would caution that we all hear Auden's words when he spoke of empathy, saying it is that prohibitive fracture empathy cannot transgress. Thank you.